Recording going now. I'm gonna make sure I get the screen share working okay.
Okay, so maybe that's even better. I think I'll stop mine.
All right. We should have a recording on Blue Jeans in simulcast.
Thank you very much for your Herculean effort, everyone, in just getting this thing recorded. Hopefully next week we will not have such an issue. Welcome everyone to the first KCP community meeting. I'm super excited to see so many people, excited to be able to talk to people about this. We've been sort of working on it behind the scenes for a little while, and I can finally tell people we're working on this. So that's very exciting, even just in its on its face. I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. I think we should probably have this meeting every week. For now, I think we should do this meeting every week at this time. Over time, we might decide to move it up or back or different days or whatever. We'll probably try to record them better than we have done this week in future weeks. And one last imploring to go to the agenda doc and sign yourselves in and let us know that you were here. My intention is to sort of take notes, summarize the discussion, and then put that into the issue being the sort of public record of what we talked about, and we can link to other issues and open new issues, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I was going to add one note, Jason, as we went through. So a couple of folks who really did want to attend this week can't, and part of this is we were kind of discussing, what the structure of this was. We felt like, it's not a project. It's definitely not a product. It's more of a prototype. We wanted to catalyze discussion, and not all discussions should happen here. They should happen in the right places. We wanted to be a focal point, but not a blocking function. And then, so one of the things, I was just saying this before, there's a cluster API meeting at 1, office hours, Chris Hines on the call. We were going to jump over to that and talk about some of these issues. Would it be interesting for vCluster? One of the thoughts I had would be a lot of this is folks who are interested can come here, but then part of what Jason and David and myself and others who want to can do is kind of go off and find things and bring them back so we can summarize and look for opportunities to engage. So it's I don't know if I call this a spider web attempt to try and tie together efforts in the ecosystem, but they definitely don't all live here. So if there's places where we should be engaging and you're on this call and you'd love us to engage there, let's do that as well and record it. We'll try to find a structure that works for this. That's really important because KCP is a concentrator, but it is not yet anything that is like what we would call a traditional project.
Yeah, I'll take it back. Yeah, it's definitely you'll hear the word experiment 1 million times. You'll hear the word prototype 1 million times. The Slack channel is called KCP Prototype specifically because we don't want to make it seem like it's more mature than it is. It's not very mature. So
yeah, and I would add that you would find the word hack in a number of places, also in the code, especially in the Kubernetes fork that has been started to support those prototype work.
Yeah,
so that's on purpose, of course.
Because my understanding.
Because the whole point is to hack some things that can, showcase what we would need to go further, and what also could be very beneficial to other parts of Kubernetes on the go. So that's on purpose hacky and precisely to be able to then understand and discuss how this could be made more cleanly and benefit to other Kubernetes stakeholders.
Yeah, I think
hack is a great part of this for now.
Yeah, for a good time, grep for the word hack in that repo because there's some awful things that go on there. So I think there's a good area in the docs of sort of what we intend to investigate. I wanted to go over those at a high level, and we can drill in if anybody has more thoughts, questions, comments, things like that. thank you, Clayton, for writing those docs, because that's super helpful to like sort of focus us on what the areas are. In summary, they are, well, at a high level, KCP is this like minimal API server, but it doesn't really deserve to exist just on its own. Like the way I think about it is that Kubernetes already works for so many people, so we have to. Oh my God, more people in the waiting room. 1 second. I will rejoin in the account that has the ability to join other people from the waiting room. That's very annoying. 1 second. All right, we're back, and now I can have people join. Anyway,
for those of you who have just joined, this meeting is being recorded, and there's not a record button because we're kind of hacked it up because we have trouble recording through the record button, which didn't exist, but it's being recorded. If you object, put up your hand and/or leave or whatever.
This is sort of the prototype meeting about the prototype, I think.
Yeah, these sorts of hacks are the things you should come to expect from this effort. Anyway, yeah, the minimal API server is interesting and cool and fun, but on its own, I think, is not enough to motivate the sort of changes we have to make to upstream Kubernetes. So even if those are overall improvements to Kubernetes, like we need something to overcome the activation energy of being able to change such a large and important thing. So the areas of investigation that sort of help us motivate these changes are transparent multi-cluster. The demo that Clayton gave in his KubeCon talk or in the keynote, was sort of a demonstration of how you could talk to a KCP that fronts two real clusters behind it, give it a deployment, and something talking to KCP splits it into two deployments that run on each cluster. That demo it mostly actually works. I think we're probably maybe 80% of that is actual backed by real code, maybe 90.
Yeah, even I'd say 90, 95.
Perfect.
According to the last test I did just before the meeting.
Yeah, which is pretty good for a prototype. Pretty good. So that's sort of an area of investigation that we think this minimal API server could help us realize. Another one is logical clusters, to be able to say, why have multiple teams share one cluster that they can all, RBAC keeps them from being able to talk to each other, but RBAC is incomplete and imperfect, and CRDs and other cluster namespace things leak across these namespaces. So logical clusters being sort of a higher barrier between clusters, between teams sharing a cluster, is another sort of area we expect KCP to be able to make progress and benefit users.
Maybe just a point here. I spoke about hacks just before, and especially even currently, you should be able to leverage a first hacky version of CRD tenancy. That means that across logical clusters and the existing KCP, if you just add a customer source definition in one logical cluster, it's not at all reflected in the other logical clusters, even in the published API resources or open API model. So we already have CRD tenancy. Of course, that should be implemented obviously differently in the future. But at least to play with that, it should be possible already now.
Yeah. CRDs being a very good example of a cluster namespace thing that you might not want to bleed across. There's effectively one in regular vanilla Kubernetes. There's effectively one version of each version of a CRD type. That's a weird sentence. That is immediately applied to all namespaces across the cluster. Well, with David's CRD tenancy mega hack, now you can sort of partition a real cluster into many logical clusters and apply a CRD definition to one logical cluster, but not all of them. That's the second area of investigation and sort of what we'd like to be able to prove out. The third one is just to be able to use, what would you do with a minimal API server? What would you do with a Kubernetes cluster that didn't have pods or didn't have deployments or didn't have nodes? And I think there are a number of projects, both silly hacks and actual, real life useful things that intend to use the Kubernetes sort of declarative reconciling API model to express non-cluster things, like go create a Slack channel for me, and when I rename it, I express that via a spec change or a metadata change, and it applies it, reconciles it with real life, and then tells me how that goes. I think there's a huge area of people already doing this on top of regular Kubernetes and sort of trying to hide or cut out the pods and nodes and deployment side. What would they build? What would you build if you didn't have to do that? If we could just give you an API server that we could that looked and felt like Kubernetes, but didn't have all of those pesky, containers. Those are the three areas of investigation, and then I think there's sort of a fourth meta one, which is what do we need to improve about Kubernetes to be able to do any of these things? Like some of them are going to be COD tenancy requires, terrible hacks in the guts of Kubernetes. We would like to experiment with those, investigate them, figure out what those need to be mature and accepted as KEPs and merged as code, and then make those changes. That's not the only one. There's also being able to scalably watch a ton of things across multiple namespaces of multiple clusters all at once. I think we know that watching at that scale won't work today. So while we're experimenting with all the other stuff, we're going to come up with stuff that doesn't work, fix those things, upstream those things, make Kubernetes better, leave it better than we found it.
And I was going to add, so like the control planes was a general topic at KubeCon. There's certainly a couple of analysts, and I've heard this coming from others. There's there's quite a few red hatters on this call who are in various areas that we dragooned into the represent what interesting customer problems emerge in Kubernetes, or user problems, or community problems, or technical problems that don't quite fit cleanly into the historical version of Kubernetes. But if you think about like evolution of an ecosystem, what are the things that we could do across the board that make everything? So it's kind of like building up Jason's point. So some of the red hatters here are, I saw some of them joining, are folks that, was specific, like, hey, you're going to need to think about this. Which problems do you have? Michael represents the ACM project, which has done a lot of work, over the years on hub clusters. And so some of this is like, okay, can we create enough momentum of ideas of where this would go that we could say we could see all of our lives getting easier, and trying to bring that together. Are there things that we didn't talk about from folks here who we had a couple questions on issues. Does anybody feel like they want to speak up and talk about what they're looking for and what they need, and goals they might have that they'd like to see explored or explore?
I'd like to bring up that as written right now with the sort of primitive syncer, whose job is to look at stuff, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not just CRDs, it's any resource that I can define here and sync down to there, vice versa, right? So with that controller in play, what this looks like is a nascent Hive. I don't know how many folks on the call are familiar with Hive, but that's one of the main things that Hive is responsible for kind of being above a bunch of a bunch of physical clusters, if you will, and you're able to define a thing at the Hive level, right? And put your resources into what's called a sync set, and have Hive go and sync those things down into your cluster, which seems like a lot like what the current cluster controller is doing in the KCP prototype. That being the case, like I don't know whether that means that we want to look to whether KCP ends up, whether we want to replace Hive with a KCP-ism, or whether we can use KCP to do stuff to Hive or whatever. But I do think that it means that a lot of the lessons that Hive has learned over its over the last couple of years could be well taken to inform the direction of KCP in that regard. And Devin, I want to throw Devin under the bus, but he's here and maybe he can.
And Michael, too, like in ACM and the projects there, and there's a lot of discussion around how do you copy things down. There've been a couple community projects. It's like I have a cube resource, I want to fan it out. Certainly, we've gone back and like all points on the config spectrum of how do you take config in one declarative form and put it in another set of places are being explored. Maybe we should ask a question about whether that's a KCP goal or whether that's something that we could say maybe is more of an ecosystem goal of maybe we help detail the different points on the spectrum and talk about the places that have gaps. That could be one way to talk through that.
Yeah, I think there's also the recursion of it though, right? Because the logical KCP cluster might use the Hive project or Open Cluster Management, which just is sort of including Hive as well, to provision a cluster against a target cloud. It might use something like a Crossplane to provision a managed Kubernetes cluster across a cloud. There might be other models of provisioning as well. So the logical cluster itself, I guess, there's value in keeping the separation of here is a logical cluster that underneath the covers might have multiple different ways of manifesting a physical cluster and not having those get too entangled among themselves. Or
is there anyone here from Crossplane? I didn't know. We definitely talked to a couple folks and we had poked around, but I don't know if anybody specifically from Crossplane is here.
Yeah, my name is Dan. I know a couple of y'all. And I'm a maintainer of the Crossplane project. We definitely noticed this at KubeCon last week, and we do some things like this internally. I work at Upbound, which is the company that founded Crossplane, and we have some ideas around it as well. One of the big things, from our perspective, is if you're stripping out Kubernetes primitives such as pods, et cetera, a big part of Crossplane and some similar projects as well, is that we allow you to, spin up new pods in the forms of providers, right? So it's not just a static set of controllers. And you could look at this in a variety of ways and how this could accommodate that model. One being that, each of those providers themselves could have some sort of bundled API server, right? And they could either connect to each other and share a control plane, or could have kind of their individual ones as well. But I think what that leads to, right, is there's a spectrum of use cases of this. So one of the things that I guess I personally, and I won't speak for everyone from the Crossplane project, but I think we're looking at something that can be sort of like a framework to be able to build things that are at different parts along that spectrum, right? And make it really easy to fit your use case. And no matter what sort of amount of Kubernetes API you want to consume in your given project.
And someone else brought this up recently. We were kind of riffing on, there's like how much of, Kube is not necessarily built to be reusable necessarily, even though it was kind of an early project goal. We wanted to carve stuff off. It's never quite reached what I would call critical mass, where we made a hard cut line, and David and a few other folks, like David Eads and Jordan and I and Dan Smith and a couple others, early on when we were splitting out Library Go and API server, we got 90% of the way, but we never got that 100% of the way because we weren't sure what use cases we'd have to support. There's definitely a part of my mind, which is Dan is not here today. He was one of those people who couldn't make it, but we were riffing on he had done a talk a couple of years ago at KubeCon in Austin, and Tim had also done a talk. Tim Hawken had also done a talk. We were like, we think we can get over the hump, but we need to all agree on what the use cases are. So a subtle part here would be, if we can get 5 use cases, the KEP becomes very easy to write. And then if we can get a couple of people to help, because SIG machinery would bear the brunt of it, and those people are always everything's always on fire. My subtle goal would be can we bring people and problems and use cases and get some of these things that are almost over the edge and just tip them over the edge in a way that we all benefit. There was another point you brought up too that I think I was going to ask others if they've seen the idea that there's different sets of APIs. So like Cube kind of has one set of APIs and everybody layers on their APIs on top. And it's hard to write good APIs, but when good APIs show up, it's often you're mixing them with APIs that don't make sense. So one of the things that I think, Jason brought this up on Twitter, was sets of APIs that logically make sense. If we could coming up with use cases for it. So like the transparent multi-cluster for me was like, could I co-opt the whole Cube ecosystem and bring it along, right? Like everybody has an app, suddenly all your Cube apps get more useful. If you can standardize and Karmada and others have done this. That was a big inspiration. Federation V1 tried to do this and we hit some roadblocks. If you could take the existing Cube model and make it work differently or mostly with high fidelity, what does that look like? But then there's a completely different set, which was Jason's focus. And I think Crossplane hits this too, is like, I had made up some examples. Gorkum, who's on the call, and I were riffing, like, could you do a Heroku style 12-factor app CRD and mix in a few of the concepts in Cube, but then cut everything else out. So like you might have secrets and config maps and a 12-factor app for something like a Heroku deployment. And we were going to do a Netlify example and a demo such that you could build everything you wanted and the word Cube never comes up, but you could still reuse some of the bits. There's been one like infrastructure or management. Are there other use cases folks have thought about, Daniel or anybody who you're thinking about different groups of APIs living side by side for different personas that might be useful or important to talk about here or that we can start factoring into our work?
I think even I don't have another example, but I think even being able to present a set of like the Heroku 12 factor app might be a controller that boils down to pods somewhere. But if my users never need to see those pods or care about those pods, I can hide them from them much more effectively if that API is if the API is more flexible, right? Like give me your 12-factor app and I'll take care of it. Don't worry what's behind, don't look behind the curtain. There are pods back there, of course, but like you won't be able to see them. I think that's sort of an orthogonal question to what are the different sets of APIs that people might come up with. A separate question is, or a separate point is to be able to hide, sweep stuff under the rug and not let people see that it's actually just pods at the end of the day. I think one interesting thing that Dan brought up was also and it came up on Twitter in a couple of places, and maybe in one of the issues was sort of in this model you still need to run controllers against this somehow, right? Like it's not going to magically make breakfast for you without somebody doing something. And in Kubernetes, you have pods, you have deployments, you have things that can run right there next to it. I think it is an open area of exploration, and I want to see what people do with it to be able to figure out how to run controllers against this without it also bringing pods along with it. I know that we've talked about having KCP be a library that you could just embed in your own application, or embed in a binary. Or Daniel, you said framework. I don't know if we want to have the framework versus library distinction, but like yes, I agree. I want it to be something that you can package into your binary that is the controller, so that it is, or a set of controllers, a number of controllers. I know that there's also been, I think Kelsey Hightower has some examples of, I think it's admission controller webhooks that are external services running. All you need is just HTTPS, that's it. So that's another sort of option, is to run KCP somewhere and have it call out to other controllers running, anywhere. But now the question is, where do I run that? Well, the answer is anywhere, right, which is both helpful and not helpful. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's an active sort of question I have for people as we go forward is where do you want to run your controllers against this? Do you want to bundle it in and have it be one binary or constellation of local binaries, or some remote, some local? some third option I've never thought of.
Yeah, that I feel like that kind of getting to those different levels of exposures of API concepts you were talking about. I generally think of it as like in Crossplane world, right? We're running these providers for folks, but they don't ever see the pods or deployments, kind of like you're saying. So we kind of have this sense of operator facing or controller facing APIs versus user facing APIs. Which, I don't know how well that scales across all projects, but at least for us, there is a pretty strong distinction there. And obviously the controllers also access the user-facing APIs to reconcile them. But that's been a pretty good breaking point. Another analogy, kind of since, I guess, the KCP talk last week that we've been chatting about a little bit is kind of the SQLite model. If folks are familiar with how that works, right? You can run SQLite alongside your application on a single box if you want to. You can embed it in your application. You could run it on a separate server if you wanted to, and treat it as more like a typical database server. And that's kind of that's the future of vision. That I feel like we're moving towards there a little bit, where it has that flexibility.
And there's actually an interesting wrinkle in this too. So kind of thinking about where do you run this? How big does it get? What's the Cube API model good for? So there's an element of this which is can we let it run a little bit and see what problems Devin and I were kind of riffing with a couple of other folks. In Cube, kind of, if you're doing multi-cluster with Cube and you want to run stuff across those clusters, the transparent multi-clusters, could you get to a point where you could kind of, most of your Cube apps just don't care, they stay resilient. Could you come up with APIs that help you bridge failure domains? Michael and I talked about this a while back. You have a hub cluster. That hub cluster needs to be reliable. How do you spread your hub cluster? Well, obviously, if your control plane and if your high cluster and your low cluster are separate, you can do things at different levels. That gives you some service advantages. But then it was okay, well, what problems don't fit in the Cube model? And it's at some point, 100,000 or so keys or 1 million keys, a meg of API object, you get too much. And that excludes things that are reasonable, like really large config objects, or really large secrets. And, in Cube today, you just break your secrets up. We source code and serverless. There's a point at which code grows beyond a couple of tens of K, and it transitions into the Git realm or into the zip file realm, or whatever your longer term storage. But a lot of bringing code and config closer together. It's what are the patterns in the ecosystem that we can enable? So there's at least a thread of this investigation, which is super high scale. How efficient could you make the API server, and how could you set up the incentives so that everybody's trying to make that more efficient? We had that in Cube, right? Folks Wojtek in the scalability has pushed us up to 10 million keys or whatever. NCD has some hard limits. As a library, can we open the door to better stores or to scaling more efficiently? Or, and this isn't covered in any of the investigations, but it is something that I wanted to suggest if other people are thinking like this, or is an idea we could get at to later over time, is can we blur the lines between code and config a little bit more effectively from a declarative perspective? And where are the gaps in that? So if you need a lot of config, you got to represent it outside of the cluster or outside of your control plane. That's awesome. What's the right pattern for that? And where do you blur the lines, right? And how do we give people the tools to let them cross back and forth? Not a key goal, but I'd like us as we go to say this probably would be better if we could do 1 billion keys. Well, maybe that belongs to the database. How could you write controllers for 1 billion keys more effectively and then tie them back in? Not everybody's going to have those problems, but I at least wanted to look for use cases where you start getting into bigger scales. And not everybody will have those, but control planes probably.
Yeah, I think that's also a good example of where we expect things we end up doing to break something, and in putting out that fire, we should also fix it for future people running into this. There was an issue about, I want to call it out because I think you briefly touched on it, and I want to make sure we're on the record about it. There was an issue about sort of investigate as an arm of investigation, swapping out etcd as the data store. I think we want to be pretty clear that that is a non-goal, at least for now. I think we will probably have plenty to do and plenty of mischief to get into without also swapping out etcd. But there are other projects in the ecosystem looking into that, working on that, and I think we're going to mess with silly hacks up here. They'll mess with silly hacks down here. Hopefully, we don't make any silly hacks that are incompatible.
Yeah, and as a library, if kind of getting to that point, I think is like if we have a library or a framework, and it's easy enough to compose it in a set of areas. The storage interface and the backend resources is absolutely one of those. They're actually pretty cleanly decoupled even in Cube today. It's all the GORP necessary to start the server that's not. I absolutely think if we do push on a KEP for library, API server as a library, a part of that should be reasonable for you to explore this space without us getting in the way. And that would help, some of the work that was going on, thinking about like what K3S went through and how while put my SIG API machinery hat on, don't have emotional energy to go chase non-etcd. But if we can open the door for others to chase it and we have those clean interfaces, that actually could really help everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Does anybody? We've been chatting for a while. Does anybody have any topics burning a hole in their head that they'd love to bring up? I think.
So I'll jump in with just one. Like as I look at the project and look at the goals and I'm curious if there is a bias towards, are we focused on developing KCP use cases that make the experience of running and dealing with tenancy and Kubernetes, the API definitions, et cetera, sort of thinking about people that are running and managing clusters, right? Certainly, there's a value proposition that with logical clusters and better tenancy, that it would be easier to have self-service without having to spin up entirely new physical clusters as a result. So there's value in that use case. Or
I agree, Michael. So we should call it out. I don't think it's called out explicitly, but enabling people organizationally to do better self-service,
yes,
probably deserves to be called out in more detail somewhere.
Well, so here's kind of the question: do we think that there is a bias on that set of use cases, which is basically making Kubernetes itself more consumable, or do we think that there's a bias around use cases which say, when I think about building a new application, I should really be considering plugging in one of these API extensions rather than thinking about creating a new REST API that is separate, right? I have a generic application. It manages a set of widget objects. It presents a set of user interface behavior, whether it's API or web console or something else. Should I be thinking about KCP as a new possible foundation upon which I should build my app? Is it another generation, and I don't want to start any dogma wars either way, but like a Spring Cloud-like thing where I think about, here's a way that I can plug in my application logic and certain aspects of authentication, authorization, storage, et cetera, are going to be cared for on my behalf by the framework, and I can just go and build an app which provides some completely non-kube, non-container. I've got a startup, it deals with widget things, and my app makes it easier to deal with widget things. So I'm kind of curious on, do we see a bias on Kubernetes consumption as a primary motivator and goal, or I'm an application developer who doesn't really understand all the ins of Kubernetes or containers, just want to build an app that does a thing?
So I'll give my biased opinion, which is I would probably say it's the former, because I think we do a bad job at the latter.
Okay.
Because the analogy might here be Rails. Could you use KCP to do something like Rails? Yes. Should you? Maybe not. I do think And this is kind of like a problem we're all going through is like, what's the right end state for infrastructure as code or code as infrastructure or distributed systems? I had kind of come into the assumption with the idea being rooted in, everybody's got lots of Kubernetes clusters, but there's a lot of stuff not on there. That's like, how do you bring the world together with a kube focus? There's a flip side discussion of if you love declarative API management and you want to have like have a place to integrate, Cube also kind of does that okay today. That was like the second one. Mm-hmm. But then the question might be really like, are we going to be super successful at anything that's not really practically tied to the Cube ecosystem or has a foot in the door? Maybe, but I'm a little bit more of a pragmatist there. I'd be interested in other people's opinions here.
I'm sort of hearing conflicting stories there because, on the one hand, you're saying we want to empower people to do things with this without getting in their way, right? And from that point of view, like boiled down, and this is happening in the chat as well, like boiled down, you're making a thing that you can write a controller to that will reconcile, that will use Cube objects as an API. And if anything you could write that controller to do, you can do, and it shouldn't really, like KCP itself its architecture shouldn't affect what you could and couldn't do with that controller.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so I think, right, our intention is for KCP to be very flexible and for it to be able to be a foundation for reconciling controllers to run against. Is that going to make it the best mobile app backend? Is that going to make it the best, are we going to replace PostgreSQL with this? No. I think you need to decide, based on what your needs are, scaling and latency and developer experience all in a balance, what the best backend for your thing is going to be. I think the API model and the storage scaling characteristics are really good for infrastructure. I think we know that it's pretty good for infrastructure, and there are some other different definitions of infrastructure that we think it could be good for. All of that being said, this is a thing we're putting out into the world. If you want to make your mobile app backend KCP, we also can't stop you. We probably won't prioritize your bugs very high if you say that your mobile app is down because, you hit some scaling limit that we didn't expect, but
maybe, distributed systems, declarative config loops, like the logical sharding of problems into, like, because I'd say, and this is like, there's a bunch of theory, like Brendan and I were riffing on this a couple of weeks ago when I was chatting with some of these ideas with him, Brendan Burns, but like, one of the original ideas was like, there's a bunch of like factors that come together in Cube. The controller pattern is strong in a set of domains. The declarative API model is strong in a set of domains. And the config loops are really strong in a set of domains. I wonder if maybe what we're saying is like, we should have like a diagram or a way of discussing this where it's like, if you have two of these three problems, KCP may be useful for you, like infrastructure and distributed systems, or infrastructure and config loops, or config loops and infrastructure or distributed systems. But if you don't have two of those problems, maybe this isn't the right thing for you, and having some way of teasing that apart. So is that a better answer, Eric?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the next question that leads to is if your use case doesn't fit two out of those three, is it even suitable for Cube at all?
Yeah, and we don't have a bunch of good examples written down, but maybe like what we've used, like what we're kind of talking about here is like, can we frame more of a fundamental, like what is KCP? What is the project's goal? What are the bounds in one of the docs where we'd say, here's an example of something that doesn't actually really fit to those. So like Devin and I were riffing on, would you model an identity system using the API patterns of Cube? So like Cube does that for small sets, but there's big boundaries, right? Like most organizations that have 100,000 or 1 million, like the biggest companies in the world have 1 million people in their LDAP. Would you put every single person into Cube as an API object? No. Would you put everybody who owns a resource on the cluster in there? Maybe. Would you model the nested relationships of an identity to group system in a Cube-like model? maybe not for things that have nothing to do with Cube, but maybe if you want to do ad hoc teaming of RBAC, then it becomes useful. So like we can try and figure out ways of like this problem doesn't quite fit, this does, and then evolve.
And why?
Maybe. Yeah, and why?
Because what I heard you say, like this problem doesn't suit because there's too many of them. If there's 1 million users in your LDAP, that's too many Cube objects. So like there's a, maybe a counterexample, and it is that, and the reason is too big, or one of the reasons.
There was a very early discussion on Cube where a lot of us were coming from backgrounds of, like building web apps, building, straightforward REST APIs and various approaches therein. And Brian Grant had like a really good point, which was, he was like, I don't remember, it was Tim, I don't remember, but like if your problem size is less than 100K or fits in memory, you should just fit yourself into memory and design as if you're going to reconstruct state and reconcile it, because the reconciler pattern fixes damage. And a lot of times when you go try to solve problems that are like too much to fit in memory, those are just really hard problems no matter what. So Cube kind of is like 100,000 in any dimension is kind of its limits. That's a good rule of thumb for a lot of problems, but as your example might hold, it wouldn't be good for the front end for a global distributed service. But most people build global distributed services out of sharded backends and logical chunks of less than 100,000 for other reasons. Can we overlay those? So that's a very useful heuristic, Eric. And maybe this is something that like we take as like one of those action items out of this meeting is, can we boil this down into something and get some iteration so that people can orient themselves?
And you've got a dimension there, which is the scale side, but you've also got a dimension there of, does your particular application or use case touch some aspect of infrastructure, right? The next generation of infrastructure management, as opposed to the next generation, to use the same example of a mobile backend, right?
Yeah. And certainly like looking at like Terraform, I think has a lot of this, kind of bring a bunch of things together. You could look at one way of looking at Terraform and other config management solutions as like, you can represent a lot of config and you've got plugins and you're combining code and declarative state. Is there anything we can do different with Cube that those can't today so that those two work well together? Or are there problems that are infrastructure-y, but most people just don't want to deal with it, like moving processes across machines, which Cube does? How do we delegate? How do we find the problems that surface that are not solved that we all want?
Are we declaring KCP, like a main thrust of KCP to be infrastructure management as a library in MAL?
It's worth asking the question.
Yeah. I think really unsatisfyingly, I don't think we exactly know what KCP will be. This is part of this is
that's what we're doing right now, right?
To figure out what it is.
Right.
I think one thing that could be confusing, and I think we should do a better job of describing it, is like the goal is sort of Kubernetes is this today, and we want to expand it to be slightly more. That doesn't mean we want to expand it to do everything, right? Like that is a recipe for failure. We want to take we think that the Kubernetes API model and infrastructure is good, and we want to apply it to slightly more in the grand scheme of things, but not to make it a message bus or file system or any of the. I can make up a terrible hack.
I bet you'd be a great message bus.
I disagree, but we by all means try, right? Like part of this is that we're going to make it flexible, and you can do whatever you want with it. Come and tell us how it failed or how it succeeded, so that we can follow you or never go down that path ever again.
So we're coming up on 5 minutes left. For folks who haven't had a chance to pipe in or haven't wanted to, are there any other topics, questions about intent, goals, things that, declarations of love, declarations of hatred, anything along those lines?
Just sort of a thing that I'm watching and we've talked about a lot, but I'm coming at this from a perspective of somebody who maintains one of these or writes and maintains one of these sorts of applications and struggles with the limitations of a Kubernetes cluster. And I'm just watching and trying to understand how we're going to avoid those same problems if we're going to a higher level, which has the same sort of limitations. Everything in memory, one one etcd and these sorts of things. That's something I've been asking about a lot, and I'm still not 100% sure like how we push beyond the problem we have. I just want to make sure that I'm not heading for the same problem up at another layer.
Definitely something we should cover in some of the same kinds of conversations we just had. Other folks? I will represent one. I'll represent one audience that I don't know is fully represented here. Certainly, almost everyone I know who has multiple clusters has some kind of self-service planning, plotting, scheduling that mostly falls under the transparent multi-cluster reference of Michael, but like for self-service. But I do feel the one thing that everyone struggles with is when you build a platform on top of cubes, or you're building like your app platform for teams. I kind of wanted to get to a spot, and the idea would be maybe some of the different goals kind of help make this better would be, can we have more building blocks for organizations that are building platforms for their own teams? And so there's different audiences that everybody has. Cube kind of is in one particular focus. There's much different user experience focus, like Backstage is a great example of a project that uses Cube but not focused on Cube. Can we make more tools and libraries available that kind of helps collapse the duplication? So I don't know, that is implicit in some of these, but it's not explicitly called out that helping people build platforms should get easier, especially for large sets of application teams. That's just personal bias that I come in with my Red Hat hat on of lots of large enterprise customers. Everybody has this problem and everybody reinvents the wheel. Can I help not reinvent the wheel by reinventing a wheel?
To reinvent the wheel one last time, I mean it. Yeah. Yes, exactly. We need a 15th standard. Yeah. Does anybody else have anything any ideas, anything they've been sitting on?
I think I would just mention from my point of view being here, I'm looking at KCP to understand how, in a similar boat to what Devin was talking about, is how it would solve issues for us, at least, where we run an operator across multiple clusters that's configured with relatively the same configuration and storing that state at a higher level. I'm not sure how bringing that configuration and the state up one level solves the scaling problems for us, because as we get, maybe thousands of these virtual clusters at the bottom, I don't know how that scales, but for us, repeating that configuration across clusters is painful. And it seems like KCP could solve some of those answers for us, but it's something that I'm here to at least see how this evolves and see what problems this solves for us.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's that seems like something we will find out we've accidentally made worse, and then have to figure out how to make it better to make up for how we've made it worse. Yeah, that might be a good topic for a future meeting. With zero minutes left. I think we should have this again next week. Hopefully without 10 minutes of preamble trying to figure out how to record the damn thing. Thank you, Michael, for recording this. I will collect notes, put them in the issue. If you have any comments, questions, join us on the Slack. Meet us next week. I'm excited to make some stuff. All right. Have a good week, everybody.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Bye.